placed at the very beginning of your video. Before you scroll away, listen closely, because this is not just a love story, it's a quiet rebellion against loneliness, time, and the lies society tells women about worth and desire. If you believe second chances don't expire, if you believe love can arrive late but hit harder, then subscribe now, because stories like this don't just entertain, they stay with you. Story script: long, single paragraph narrative. Black woman was still a virgin at 40, until the cowboy asked to stay in her cabin during 6 months. Her name was Ruthlyn Moore, and by the time the wind carved permanent lines into the pine trees surrounding her cabin in the Blue Ridge foothills, the world had already decided who she was without ever asking her permission, labeling her with quiet cruelty as invisible, undesirable, too late, too cautious, too alone. Yet Ruthlyn had learned to live inside that silence the way some people learn to live with a limp, adjusting her stride so the pain didn't show, waking every morning before sunrise to tend her small vegetable patch, teaching literature remotely to community college students who never knew their professor graded essays while wrapped in a wool shawl beside a wood-burning stove. And when she turned 40, she didn't throw a party or make a wish, she simply stood on her porch and let the cold air remind her she was still here, still breathing, still untouched, not by lack of desire but by a lifetime of choosing safety over risk after growing up watching her mother disappear piece by piece in bad relationships that promised warmth and delivered bruises. So Ruthlyn promised herself she would never trade peace for passion, never let hunger make her reckless, and that promise held strong until the afternoon a horse limped into her clearing followed by a man who looked like he'd ridden straight out of another century. Tall, dust-stained, sun-creased, his hat worn soft with years of weather and regret, introducing himself as Eli Carter with a voice that carried both apology and restraint as he explained a late snowstorm had destroyed the bridge leading to his seasonal grazing land and he needed a place to stay until spring repairs were finished. 6 months at most, he said, quick to add he could sleep in the barn or even outside, that he'd pay, fix fences, disappear when asked. But Ruthlyn saw something in the way he didn't step closer, didn't look her over, didn't soften his request with charm, and against every rule she'd built her life upon, she heard herself say yes. The spare room was small, the rules were simple, and the understanding was clear. This was temporary, practical, emotionless, and for the first weeks it truly was, two strangers orbiting one another politely, sharing meals without questions, exchanging nods more than words, until small things began to shift like tectonic plates beneath daily routine. Eli repairing a broken step without being asked, Ruthlyn leaving an extra mug of coffee by the door before his early rides, conversations stretching longer into the evenings, laughter surprising them both, and for the first time in years Ruthlyn felt seen not as a possibility or a problem but as a presence, a woman with opinions, humor, anger, and depth. And Eli never asked why she lived alone or why there were no photographs of lovers past, never pushed, never hinted, which somehow made the space between them louder, heavier, charged with all the things unsaid, until one stormbound night when the power went out and they sat by the fire telling truths like confessions disguised as stories, Eli admitting he'd buried a wife and a child in the same year and couldn't bring himself to rebuild a home where grief echoed too loudly, Ruthlyn admitting she'd never been touched. Not because she wasn't wanted but because she'd never felt safe enough to want back. And the silence that followed wasn't awkward but reverent, like something sacred had been placed between them, and from that night forward the cabin changed, not with actions but with awareness, every glance a question, every accidental brush of hands a thunderclap, until Ruthlyn began to fear the calendar more than her feelings because 6 months suddenly felt like a countdown to loss. And when rumors reached town that the bridge repairs would finish early, panic settled in her chest like winter frost, prompting a confrontation she never planned, asking Eli one quiet morning if he intended to leave the moment the road reopened, and he answered honestly that he didn't know how to stay anywhere without running from what he felt, and that answer broke something open in her, because for the first time she understood that love wasn't about timing or experience or age but courage. And the night before his planned departure, they sat on the porch watching the stars in a silence thick with goodbye, until reached for his hand not as a plea but as a truth, and what followed was not rushed or graphic or desperate but tender, deliberate, rooted in trust, two people choosing presence over fear. And when morning came it didn't erase her solitude but transformed it, because whether Eli stayed or left, was no longer defined by what she hadn't done but by what she'd finally allowed herself to feel, and in the end Eli did leave for a time, not as an escape but to close the chapter he'd been avoiding, returning months later not on a limping horse but with intention, asking not for shelter but partnership, and, standing taller than she ever had at 41, answered not with hesitation but with certainty, because love hadn't arrived late, it had arrived exactly when she was strong enough to receive it.